The cathedral bells rang out across the misty morning air as Margaret Thompson watched her daughter Sarah adjust her pearl earrings one final time, completely unaware that in just 3 hours, the man who had abandoned them both 15 years ago would walk through those church doors carrying a secret so devastating it would shatter everything Sarah believed about her own identity and turn what should have been the most beautiful day of her life into a public humiliation that would be whispered about in their small Georgia town for decades to come. Sometimes the ghosts from our past don't just haunt us quietly in the shadows. They burst through the front door of our most sacred moments with revelations that change everything we thought we knew about love, family, and the lies people tell to protect themselves from the consequences of their own selfish choices. Hi there, I'm Tina, and I want you to settle in with me today because what I'm about to share with you is one of those stories that will make you question everything you think you know about family secrets and the lengths some people will go to rewrite history when it suits their needs. Margaret's story is going to take you on an emotional journey that explores betrayal, forgiveness, and the incredible strength it takes to protect the people we love when the very foundations of our lives are shaken by someone else's desperate attempt to ease their own guilt. If you've ever dealt with an ex who tried to disrupt your peace, a family secret that changed everything, or wondered how you'd react if someone from your past showed up at your most important moment with shocking news, this story is going to hit you right in the heart. I promise you'll want to hear every single detail of what happens when Margaret's ex-husband reveals his bombshell secret, so please hit that like button to let me know you're here with me. And don't forget to subscribe, because I bring you real stories about real people navigating life's most challenging moments. Trust me, what happens at Sarah's wedding will leave you absolutely speechless. Now let me tell you about Margaret and how one uninvited guest turned her daughter's perfect day into an unforgettable nightmare. Margaret had spent the last 18 months planning every detail of Sarah's wedding to Michael Chen, a dedicated pediatric nurse who had won her heart during their residency rotations at Atlanta General Hospital. And Margaret couldn't have been more proud of the strong, compassionate man her 26-year-old daughter had chosen to build a life with. As a 43-year-old high school principal who had raised Sarah as a single mother since her divorce from Richard Thompson when Sarah was only 11 years old, Margaret had poured her heart and soul into creating a celebration that would honor both her daughter's accomplishments as a newly graduated doctor and her dreams for a future filled with love, purpose, and the kind of stability that Margaret had worked so hard to provide after Richard walked out on them without warning or explanation. The elegant reception venue overlooking the Chattahoochee River had been booked for over a year. The flowers were a perfect blend of Sarah's favorite white peonies and Michael's cultural heritage represented through carefully chosen orchids, and every detail from the hand-calligraphed invitations to the 3-tiered cake decorated with delicate sugar flowers had been chosen to reflect the sophisticated taste and warm personality that made Sarah such a beloved daughter, friend, and soon-to-be wife. Margaret's relationship with Richard had ended so abruptly and completely that she sometimes wondered if those 12 years of marriage had been nothing more than an elaborate performance on his part, a carefully constructed facade that he had maintained until the moment he decided that fatherhood and family responsibilities were incompatible with whatever vision he had developed for his future life and career aspirations. Richard had been a successful real estate developer who specialized in luxury commercial properties, and Margaret had always assumed that his long hours and frequent business trips were simply the price of building the kind of financial security that would allow them to give Sarah every opportunity and advantage as she grew up in an increasingly competitive world. The signs of his growing dissatisfaction and restlessness had been subtle at first, manifesting as increased criticism of Margaret's teaching career, complaints about the demands of family life, and a general attitude of superiority that suggested he viewed their small-town lifestyle as beneath his evolving sense of himself and his potential for success in larger markets and more prestigious social circles. The divorce had been swift and brutal, with Richard using his financial resources and legal connections to minimize his child support obligations while also ensuring that he would have no requirement for regular visitation or involvement in Sarah's daily life and emotional development. Margaret had been devastated by the betrayal, but had quickly channeled her pain into fierce determination to prove that she and Sarah could thrive without Richard's presence or financial support. Working extra hours as a substitute teacher and tutor while pursuing her master's degree in educational administration that would eventually lead to her current position as principal. Sarah had initially been confused and heartbroken by her father's sudden departure, asking repeatedly when he would come home and whether she had done something wrong to make him leave. But Margaret had worked tirelessly to help her daughter understand that Richard's choices reflected his own character flaws rather than any failure on Sarah's part to be the kind of daughter who deserved love and commitment from both parents. The years that followed Richard's departure had been challenging but ultimately rewarding, as Margaret and Sarah developed an incredibly close bond built on mutual respect, open communication, and shared determination to create a life filled with meaning, achievement, and genuine happiness that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or presence. Sarah had excelled academically throughout high school and college, earning a full scholarship to medical school where she had met Michael and discovered her passion for emergency medicine that would allow her to combine her natural empathy with her intellectual gifts in service to patients facing their most vulnerable and frightening moments. Margaret had watched with pride and amazement as her daughter grew into a confident, compassionate young woman who had learned from her father's abandonment that true strength comes from within, and that the most important relationships are built on consistent actions rather than empty promises or dramatic gestures designed to impress rather than truly connect. The morning of Sarah's wedding dawned with the kind of perfect weather that seemed like a blessing from above, with gentle sunlight filtering through the ancient oak trees surrounding the historic church where Margaret had been baptized as a child, and where she had always dreamed Sarah would someday exchange vows with someone who truly understood and appreciated her remarkable spirit and generous heart. Margaret woke up early in the bridal suite at the charming bed and breakfast where the wedding party was staying, feeling a mixture of excitement, gratitude, and the bittersweet awareness that this day marked the end of an era in their mother-daughter relationship, while also celebrating the beginning of Sarah's new life as a wife and partner to someone who loved her completely and unconditionally. The ivory silk wedding dress hanging carefully by the window had been Margaret's own mother's gown from 1952, altered to fit Sarah's taller frame while preserving the classic elegance and timeless beauty that made it perfect for a bride who valued tradition, family history, and the connections that link one generation to the next through shared experiences and cherished memories. Sarah had been awake for hours already, too excited and nervous to sleep, spending quiet time writing in the journal she had kept since elementary school, and reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment of committing her life to Michael and their shared vision of building a family based on mutual support, honest communication, and the kind of deep partnership that creates space for both individual growth and collective dreams. Margaret could hear Sarah moving around in the adjoining room, probably checking and rechecking the various details and timelines that would coordinate the day's events, and she smiled as she recognized her daughter's need to feel prepared and in control, even in situations where the most important elements were matters of the heart rather than logistics and planning. The breakfast tray that had been delivered to their suite included Sarah's favorite blueberry scones and the special blend of Earl Grey tea that Margaret had been serving at important occasions since Sarah was old enough to appreciate the ritual of sharing something elegant and meaningful together. The morning routine proceeded smoothly as Sarah's maid of honor Jessica arrived with the hairstylist and makeup artist, followed by Michael's sister Amy and Margaret's closest friend Patricia, who had been like a second mother to Sarah throughout her childhood and had earned the honorary title of aunt through years of consistent presence and unconditional love. The atmosphere in the bridal suite was warm and celebratory, with soft classical music playing in the background, mimosas being shared among the adults, and the kind of excited chatter and laughter that characterizes moments when people who genuinely care about each other come together to celebrate love and commitment. Margaret noticed that Sarah seemed unusually calm and centered for someone on her wedding day, radiating the kind of quiet confidence that comes from making a decision based on deep knowledge and trust rather than external pressure or romantic fantasy. You know, there's something magical about watching your child become an adult who makes choices that reflect everything you hoped you were teaching them about love, respect, and the importance of choosing partners who bring out the best in who they are, rather than trying to change them into someone else entirely. Have you ever experienced that moment when you realize that your child has become someone you genuinely admire and would want to be friends with, even if you weren't related? Margaret was feeling that sense of pride and amazement as she watched Sarah interact with her bridesmaids and discuss the day's plans with a maturity and grace that reflected years of learning to trust her own judgment and value her own worth, regardless of what anyone else might think or say. My dear friends, I need to pause here for just a moment, because what happens next in this story is so unexpected and emotionally intense that you're going to want to make sure you're settled in and ready for the roller coaster of feelings that Margaret and Sarah are about to experience. If this story is already resonating with you, if you've ever had to protect someone you love from painful truths or dealt with an ex who seemed determined to disrupt your peace, I hope you'll take a second to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because your support means everything to me and helps me continue bringing you these powerful real-life stories that remind us we're not alone in facing life's most challenging moments. I also want to hear from you in the comments about your own experiences with family secrets, unexpected revelations, or times when you had to choose between protecting someone's feelings and revealing difficult truths. What other family drama stories would you like me to share? Your suggestions and engagement help me understand what matters most to this amazing community we're building together. Trust me, what Richard reveals when he shows up at the church is going to change everything Margaret thought she knew about her marriage, her divorce, and the real reason he abandoned his family 15 years ago. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, which gave the wedding party plenty of time for photographs, final preparations, and the kind of quiet moments that allow brides and their families to savor the significance of the day rather than rushing through it in a blur of activity and stress. Margaret had specifically requested this timeline because she wanted Sarah to have the opportunity to truly experience and remember every detail of her wedding day, from the morning preparations through the evening celebration, creating memories that would remain vivid and meaningful throughout her marriage and beyond. The photographer had already captured beautiful images of Sarah in her grandmother's dress, Margaret helping with the delicate pearl buttons that ran up the back of the gown, and the touching moment when Sarah placed her grandmother's vintage diamond bracelet around her wrist as her something old and borrowed. The historic church where Sarah and Michael would exchange vows was a masterpiece of Southern Gothic architecture that had served their community for over 150 years, with soaring stained glass windows that cast rainbow patterns across the honey-colored wooden pews, and an altar decorated with cascading arrangements of white flowers that created an atmosphere of sacred beauty and timeless romance. Margaret had walked through these same aisles as a child every Sunday with her parents and grandparents, and the church held memories of Christmas pageants, Easter services, and countless moments of prayer and reflection that had shaped her understanding of faith, community, and the importance of marking life's most significant transitions in places that connect us to something larger than ourselves. The guest list included family members from 3 generations, childhood friends who had remained close despite geographical distances and changing life circumstances, colleagues from both Sarah's medical school and Margaret's education career, and the kind of extended community that forms around people who invest in building genuine relationships based on mutual respect and shared values. Michael's family had traveled from California for the wedding, bringing with them traditions and customs that reflected their Chinese-American heritage, while also embracing the Southern hospitality and warmth that had made them feel welcomed and valued from the moment Sarah had first introduced Michael to Margaret during their second year of medical school. The blending of their 2 family cultures had been seamless and natural, with both sides recognizing that love transcends differences in background and that the most important thing was the obvious happiness and compatibility that Sarah and Michael shared in their approach to life, work, and their dreams for the future. Margaret had grown to love Michael's parents like her own family, appreciating their wisdom, generosity, and the way they had raised a son who treated their daughter with the kind of respect and devotion that every parent hopes their child will find in a life partner. The morning preparations continued without any hint of the drama that was about to unfold, with Margaret feeling grateful and peaceful as she watched Sarah transform from her everyday beautiful self into a radiant bride who seemed to glow with inner happiness and anticipation. The makeup artist had enhanced Sarah's natural beauty with subtle elegance that would photograph beautifully while still looking like herself, and the hairstylist had created an intricate updo that showcased the vintage pearl earrings that had been Margaret's wedding gift to her daughter. Sarah's bouquet was a stunning arrangement of white peonies, baby's breath, and delicate greenery tied with ivory satin ribbon that perfectly complemented the classic simplicity of her grandmother's dress, creating a bridal look that was both timeless and personally meaningful to their family's history and traditions. Margaret was helping Sarah with her grandmother's pearl necklace when her phone buzzed with a text message from the church coordinator indicating that all the vendors had arrived on schedule and that the sanctuary was ready for the photographer to begin taking pre-ceremony shots of the altar and decorations. The wedding party would be leaving the bed and breakfast in vintage cars that Michael's best man had arranged as a surprise, and Margaret felt a surge of excitement as she realized that everything they had planned and dreamed about for the past 18 months was finally coming together in perfect harmony. Sarah looked absolutely stunning in her wedding attire, but more importantly, she radiated the kind of joy and confidence that comes from knowing you're making a decision that feels completely right and authentic to who you are and what you want your life to become. The drive to the church took them through the historic downtown area where Margaret had grown up and where Sarah had spent countless hours as a child visiting the library, attending community events, and learning to appreciate the value of being part of a place where people know each other's stories and care about each other's well-being. The autumn leaves were at their peak color, creating a backdrop of gold and crimson that made the entire town look like a painting, and Margaret felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the life she and Sarah had built together in this community that had supported them through the difficult early years after Richard's departure and celebrated with them as Sarah achieved one milestone after another throughout her education and personal growth. The church parking lot was already filling with guests who had arrived early to find good seats and catch up with family members and friends they hadn't seen since the last major celebration or reunion. Margaret recognized faces from every period of Sarah's life, from elementary school teachers who had nurtured her love of learning to high school friends who had remained close despite going to different colleges and pursuing different career paths. The sight of all these people who had come together to witness and celebrate Sarah's marriage filled Margaret's heart with emotions that were almost too big to contain, and she found herself thinking about how proud her own parents would have been to see their granddaughter surrounded by so much love and support on her wedding day. Have you ever had one of those moments when you felt like everything in your life had led up to a single perfect day? When all the struggles and sacrifices suddenly made sense because they had brought you to a place of such complete happiness and fulfillment? Margaret was experiencing that kind of overwhelming gratitude as she helped Sarah out of the vintage car and watched her daughter take a deep breath before walking into the church where she would become Mrs. Michael Chen in front of everyone who mattered most to her in the world. The photographer was already capturing candid moments of their arrival, and Margaret knew that these images would become treasured family heirlooms that would allow future generations to see the joy and love that had surrounded Sarah's wedding day. But as they approached the church entrance, Margaret noticed a familiar figure standing near the side door, and her heart stopped as she recognized the man who had walked out of their lives 15 years ago and had never once reached out to ask about his daughter's graduation from high school, her acceptance to medical school, or any of the other major milestones that had marked her journey to this moment. Richard Thompson looked older than his 55 years, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that suggested years of stress or regret. But he was still recognizable as the man who had once promised to love and protect both Margaret and Sarah through whatever challenges life might bring their way. He was wearing an expensive dark suit that probably cost more than Margaret spent on clothing in an entire year, and everything about his appearance suggested that his real estate career had indeed provided him with the financial success and prestigious lifestyle that had apparently been more important to him than maintaining relationships with his wife and daughter. Margaret felt her stomach drop as she realized that Richard was holding a manila envelope and appeared to be waiting specifically for them to arrive, which meant that his presence at the church was not accidental or coincidental, but part of some planned intervention that could only bring pain and disruption to what should have been the most beautiful day of Sarah's life. Sarah noticed her mother's sudden tension and followed Margaret's gaze to where Richard stood near the church entrance, and Margaret watched her daughter's face transform from radiant joy to confusion, and then to something that looked like fear as she processed the reality that her father had somehow learned about her wedding and had chosen this moment to reappear in their lives after 15 years of complete silence and absence. The wedding party members who had arrived in the other vintage cars were beginning to gather on the church steps, chatting and laughing as they prepared for the photographer to capture group shots before the ceremony. Completely unaware of the emotional bomb that was about to explode in the middle of what had been a perfect wedding day, Margaret's protective instincts kicked in immediately as she moved closer to Sarah and tried to position herself between her daughter and the man who had caused them both so much pain through his selfish abandonment and years of deliberate neglect. Richard began walking toward them with the kind of determined expression that Margaret remembered from their marriage whenever he had made a decision that he considered non-negotiable, regardless of how it might affect other people's feelings or well-being. Margaret could see that he was nervous, but also resolute, which suggested that whatever he had come to say or do was something he had been planning for some time, rather than an impulsive decision made at the last minute. Sarah stood frozen beside her mother, still processing the shock of seeing her father after all these years and trying to understand why he would choose this particular moment to break his silence when he had ignored every other significant event in her life since their divorce. The contrast between her radiant bridal appearance and the obvious distress on her face was heartbreaking to witness, and Margaret felt rage building inside her as she realized that Richard was about to ruin the most important day of Sarah's life for reasons that could only be selfish and self-serving. "Margaret, Sarah, I know this is unexpected, but I need to speak with you both before the ceremony begins," Richard said in the same authoritative tone he had always used when he wanted to control conversations and outcomes without allowing space for discussion or disagreement. His voice carried the kind of false confidence that Margaret remembered from their worst arguments, when he would present his decisions as inevitable facts rather than choices that affected other people's lives and deserved consideration and respect. Sarah moved closer to her mother but didn't speak, and Margaret could feel her daughter trembling slightly as she struggled to process the emotional shock of this unwanted reunion and the growing realization that her father's presence was going to create some kind of scene or confrontation that would overshadow her wedding ceremony and reception. "Richard, today is Sarah's wedding day, and whatever you think you need to say can wait until after she and Michael have had their ceremony and celebration," Margaret replied with as much calm authority as she could muster, while her mind raced through possible explanations for his sudden appearance and the envelope he was clutching, like it contained something of vital importance. She could see Michael approaching from the other side of the church steps, probably wondering why his bride looked distressed and who the unfamiliar man was who seemed to be causing some kind of problem or delay in their carefully planned timeline. Margaret's biggest concern was protecting Sarah from whatever emotional manipulation or drama Richard had planned. But she was also aware that they were now surrounded by wedding guests and family members who would witness whatever scene was about to unfold. "I'm afraid it can't wait, Margaret, because what I have to tell Sarah is going to change everything she thinks she knows about her identity and her family history," Richard said, his voice carrying a mixture of guilt and desperation that made Margaret's blood run cold, as she began to understand that his unexpected appearance was connected to some kind of revelation or secret that he had apparently been carrying for years. The envelope in his hands seemed to take on sinister significance as Margaret realized that it probably contained documents or evidence related to whatever bombshell he was planning to drop on their daughter's wedding day. Sarah finally found her voice and spoke directly to her father for the first time in 15 years, her tone carrying hurt, anger, and confusion that reflected the emotional turmoil of seeing the man who had abandoned her at the moment when she was supposed to be experiencing pure joy and celebration. My beautiful friends, what I'm about to tell you next is so shocking and painful that even now, years later, Margaret still struggles to understand how Richard could have chosen to reveal such devastating information at the worst possible moment in their daughter's life. If you've been following this story and feeling the same protective anger towards Sarah that I'm experiencing as I share these details with you, please take a moment to let me know in the comments how you think you would have handled this situation and what advice you would give to a mother trying to protect her child from a selfish ex who seems determined to cause maximum emotional damage. I also want to hear about your own experiences with family secrets or unexpected revelations that changed everything you thought you knew about your identity or relationships. Your stories help remind all of us that we're not alone in facing these impossible situations where love and loyalty are tested by people who claim to care about us, but whose actions suggest otherwise. Sarah, I know you must hate me for leaving the way I did, but I need you to understand that everything I thought I knew about our family was based on a lie that your mother has been keeping from both of us for 27 years, Richard said, as he extended the manila envelope toward his daughter with hands that were visibly shaking from either nervousness or guilt. Margaret felt the world tilt around her as she heard Richard's words and began to understand that whatever secret he believed he had discovered was somehow connected to Sarah's paternity or the circumstances of her birth, which could only mean that he had been investigating their family history and had possibly uncovered information that Margaret had buried so deeply she had almost convinced herself it wasn't true. Sarah looked from her father to her mother with growing confusion and fear, clearly unable to process what Richard was suggesting or understand why he would choose this moment to reveal information that could potentially destroy everything she believed about her identity and family relationships. Margaret's mind raced backward through the years to those early months of her marriage when she and Richard had been struggling with fertility issues and the mounting pressure from both families to provide grandchildren who would continue their respective family names and traditions. The memory of that brief period of separation when Margaret had been staying with her sister in Atlanta, while she and Richard attended couples counseling and tried to work through their communication problems and different expectations about marriage and family life, felt like a lifetime ago. But apparently Richard had somehow connected that time period to questions about Sarah's parentage that had been haunting him for years. The irony was devastating because Margaret had never intended to deceive anyone, but the timing of Sarah's conception and the complicated emotions surrounding their temporary separation had created ambiguity that Margaret had chosen to resolve by keeping certain details private rather than complicating their reconciliation with information that would only cause pain and confusion. Richard, I don't know what you think you've discovered, but this is neither the time nor the place for whatever accusations or theories you've developed about our family, Margaret said firmly, while moving to place herself more completely between Richard and Sarah, who was now visibly shaking and appeared to be struggling with the emotional shock of hearing her father suggest that her entire identity was based on deception. The wedding guests were beginning to notice that something unusual was happening near the church entrance, and Margaret could see Michael's parents approaching with concerned expressions as they observed the obvious distress on their future daughter-in-law's face and the tension radiating from the confrontation between Margaret and the unfamiliar man who had clearly upset the bride just minutes before her ceremony was scheduled to begin. Richard opened the manila envelope and pulled out what appeared to be legal documents, along with several photographs and a letter written on official letterhead that Margaret couldn't identify from her current distance, but that obviously represented some kind of evidence that Richard believed supported his accusations about Sarah's parentage. I hired a private investigator 6 months ago when I started having health issues that required detailed family medical history. And what he found about the timing of Sarah's conception and the identity of the man you were seeing during our separation is all documented right here. Richard continued with the same self-righteous tone that had characterized his approach to conflict throughout their marriage. Apparently oblivious to the fact that he was destroying his daughter's wedding day and potentially her relationship with both parents in service of some misguided need to confront what he perceived as historical deception. Sarah finally spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying a strength that reminded Margaret of all the times her daughter had faced difficult situations with courage and grace, rather than allowing fear or confusion to paralyze her ability to advocate for herself and protect her own emotional well-being. Dad, whatever you think you know about Mom or about me, couldn't this conversation have waited until after my wedding? Couldn't you have found a way to approach this that didn't involve humiliating me in front of everyone I care about on what's supposed to be the happiest day of my life? The pain in Sarah's voice was heartbreaking to hear, and Margaret felt her own anger building as she watched Richard's supposed revelation cause exactly the kind of emotional damage that she had spent 15 years trying to prevent through his absence from their lives. Michael reached them at that moment, immediately moving to Sarah's side and placing a protective arm around her waist while looking between Margaret and Richard with the kind of concerned confusion that comes from walking into the middle of a family crisis without any context or understanding of the relationships and history involved. Sarah, sweetheart, what's happening? Should we postpone the ceremony until you've had time to process whatever this is about? Michael's gentle voice and obvious concern for Sarah's emotional state provided a stark contrast to Richard's aggressive approach and selfish timing. And Margaret felt grateful that her daughter had chosen a partner who instinctively prioritized her well-being over any external pressures or expectations about how wedding days should proceed according to predetermined schedules. The church coordinator appeared at Margaret's elbow, clearly concerned about the growing delay and the obvious distress of the bride, while several members of the wedding party had moved closer to offer support and protection for Sarah without fully understanding what kind of threat or challenge they were facing. Margaret realized that she was going to have to make an immediate decision about how to handle Richard's revelation and protect Sarah from further emotional damage, while also managing the very public nature of the confrontation that was unfolding in front of family members, friends, and wedding vendors who would remember and potentially gossip about whatever happened next. The weight of years of carefully maintained privacy and the complexity of truth, deception, and protective silence were all converging in this single moment that would determine not only the fate of Sarah's wedding day, but potentially the future of their mother-daughter relationship, and Sarah's ability to trust the foundation upon which she had built her entire sense of self and family identity. The documents that Richard thrust toward Sarah contained DNA test results, birth certificate analysis, and a detailed timeline that the private investigator had apparently constructed based on medical records, travel receipts, and witness interviews that painted a picture of Margaret's brief relationship with Dr. James Mitchell, the psychiatrist who had been providing couples counseling during her separation from Richard 27 years ago. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face as she realized that Richard had somehow gained access to confidential medical information and personal records that should have remained private, and that his investigation had uncovered the brief period of emotional and physical intimacy that had occurred between her and Dr. Mitchell during the darkest period of her marriage, when she had been questioning everything about her relationship with Richard and her future happiness. The irony of the situation was that Margaret had ended her relationship with Dr. Mitchell and reconciled with Richard specifically because she had discovered she was pregnant and had wanted to give their marriage another chance for the sake of their unborn child, never imagining that years later, Richard would use that same pregnancy as evidence of her deception and betrayal. Sarah's hands trembled as she looked at the DNA test results that apparently showed a high probability that Dr. James Mitchell was her biological father rather than Richard, and Margaret watched her daughter's face transform from confusion to devastation as she began to understand the implications of what Richard was revealing and the potential impact on everything she believed about her identity, her medical history, and her relationships with both of her supposed parents. The wedding guests were now openly staring at the unfolding drama, with several family members moving closer to offer support, while others maintained a respectful distance that suggested they understood they were witnessing something deeply private and painful that would have lasting consequences for everyone involved. Michael's protective presence beside Sarah provided some comfort, but Margaret could see that her daughter was struggling to process the emotional shock of learning that her entire understanding of her parentage might be based on information that her mother had deliberately withheld for nearly 3 decades. Margaret, You can't deny these results or claim that I'm making this up out of spite, because I've had 3 different laboratories confirm the DNA analysis using hair samples from Sarah's childhood that I saved from her last visit to my house before our divorce. Richard continued, with what seemed like genuine pain mixed with vindictive satisfaction at finally having evidence to support suspicions that had apparently been eating at him for years. Margaret realized that Richard's sudden departure from their lives 15 years ago had not been about his inability to handle family responsibilities, but about his growing certainty that Sarah was not his biological child, and his resentment about what he perceived as Margaret's deception about the timing and circumstances of her conception. The revelation explained so much about Richard's behavior during the final months of their marriage, his reluctance to engage with Sarah during their custody discussions, and his apparent lack of interest in maintaining any relationship with the daughter he had once claimed to love more than anything in the world. Sarah looked directly at her mother for the first time since Richard had begun his revelation, and Margaret could see in her daughter's eyes a mixture of hurt, confusion, and desperate hope that there might be some explanation that would make sense of this information without destroying everything she believed about her family and her identity. "Mom, is this true? Is Dr. Mitchell my biological father? Have you been lying to me my entire life about who I am and where I come from?" Sarah's voice carried the kind of pain that comes from feeling betrayed by the person you trust most in the world. And Margaret felt her heart breaking as she realized that no matter how she responded to Richard's accusations, the damage to her relationship with Sarah had already been done simply by introducing doubt and suspicion into what had previously been a relationship built on complete trust and mutual respect. Margaret took a deep breath and made the decision to tell the complete truth for the first time in 27 years, recognizing that any attempt to maintain the protective fiction she had created would only make the situation worse and potentially destroy any chance of rebuilding trust with her daughter in the future. "Sarah, the timing of your conception occurred during a very difficult period in my marriage to Richard when we were separated and attending counseling with Dr. Mitchell. And yes, I did have a brief relationship with him during that time that could potentially mean he is your biological father rather than Richard." The words felt like they were being torn from Margaret's heart as she watched Sarah absorb the confirmation of her worst fears about the foundation of lies upon which her entire identity had been constructed. The church coordinator approached Margaret with obvious concern about the growing delay and the need to either proceed with the ceremony or make an announcement to the waiting guests about a postponement. But Margaret waved her away as she focused entirely on her daughter's emotional state and the devastating impact that Richard's selfish timing had created for what should have been the most joyful day of Sarah's life. The other members of the wedding party stood in shocked silence, unsure whether to intervene or give the family space to process this life-changing revelation. While Michael maintained his protective position beside Sarah and whispered quiet words of support and reassurance that whatever she learned about her biological parentage wouldn't change his love for her or their commitment to building a life together. Have you ever been in a situation where someone you thought you knew completely revealed information that made you question everything you believed about your own life and relationships? The pain on Sarah's face was heartbreaking to witness, and Margaret knew that no matter what happened next, their mother-daughter relationship would never be the same because the foundation of complete honesty and trust that had sustained them through 15 years as a single-parent family had been shattered by revelations that should have been shared long ago rather than hidden out of fear and a misguided desire to protect everyone from complicated truths. Dr. James Mitchell had died 3 years earlier from complications related to pancreatic cancer, taking with him any possibility of direct answers about the relationship he had shared with Margaret during those turbulent months when her marriage to Richard had seemed beyond repair and her future happiness had felt impossible to imagine. Margaret explained to Sarah that she had ended her relationship with Dr. Mitchell and returned to Richard specifically because she had wanted to give their marriage another chance when she discovered she was pregnant, and that her decision to let Richard believe he was the father had been motivated by her genuine hope that they could rebuild their relationship and create a stable, loving home for their unborn child, rather than any deliberate intention to deceive him about Sarah's paternity. The complexity of emotions and circumstances that had led to Margaret's choices 27 years ago seemed impossible to explain adequately in the middle of a church parking lot on Sarah's wedding day, especially when the revelation was causing such obvious pain and confusion for everyone involved in the current crisis. Sarah asked the question that Margaret had been dreading for nearly 3 decades. "Mom, did you know for certain that Dr. Mitchell was my biological father, or did you genuinely believe that Richard might be?" Margaret's answer required her to admit that she had suspected the truth about Sarah's paternity, but had chosen to maintain uncertainty rather than pursuing definitive answers that might have complicated her reconciliation with Richard, or created legal and emotional challenges that she felt unprepared to handle as a young wife and expectant mother. The admission that Margaret had deliberately chosen ignorance over knowledge in order to protect herself and others from difficult truths felt like another betrayal to Sarah, who had always believed that her mother valued honesty and courage above comfort and convenience in all areas of life. Richard's expression showed a mixture of vindication and genuine sadness as he listened to Margaret's explanation and watched the devastating impact that his revelation was having on Sarah's emotional state and wedding day experience. Margaret realized that despite his terrible timing and selfish approach, Richard was experiencing his own form of grief and loss as he processed the confirmation that the daughter he had raised for 11 years was not biologically his child, and that his suspicions about Margaret's deception had been accurate all along. The tragedy of the situation was that 3 adults who had once cared deeply about each other were now standing in a church parking lot on what should have been a day of celebration, facing the consequences of choices made nearly 3 decades ago when they were all much younger and less equipped to handle the complex emotions and moral dilemmas that had shaped their family relationships. Michael finally spoke directly to Richard for the first time, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that comes from medical training and experience with crisis situations where clear thinking and compassionate leadership are essential for protecting vulnerable people from further harm. "Mr. Thompson, I understand that you believe this information is important, but Sarah is clearly overwhelmed by what you've shared, and I think we need to give her some time and space to process these revelations before making any decisions about how to proceed with today's ceremony or future family discussions." Michael's intervention created a moment of pause in the escalating emotional intensity, and Margaret felt grateful that her daughter had chosen a partner who instinctively knew how to prioritize her well-being over external pressures or expectations about how dramatic family revelations should be handled in public settings. Sarah looked around at the growing crowd of wedding guests who were now openly staring at the unfolding family drama, and Margaret could see in her daughter's eyes the humiliation and embarrassment that came from having the most private and painful aspects of her family history exposed in front of everyone she cared about on what was supposed to be her perfect wedding day. The realization that her biological father was a man she had never met, who had died without ever knowing he had a daughter, and that her entire understanding of her medical history, genetic heritage, and family connections had been based on incomplete information, created a level of identity crisis that no bride should have to face while wearing her grandmother's wedding dress and standing outside the church where she had planned to commit her life to the man she loved. "I need some time to think about all of this," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone who was witnessing her attempt to maintain dignity and composure in the face of such overwhelming emotional shock. "Michael, I don't think I can go through with the ceremony today when I don't even know who I really am anymore, or what parts of my family history are true versus what has been hidden from me my entire life." The pain in Sarah's voice was heartbreaking to hear, and Margaret realized that Richard's selfish decision to reveal this information on her wedding day had succeeded in destroying not only the celebration they had planned for 18 months, but potentially Sarah's trust in family relationships and her ability to move forward with confidence in her own identity and worth. Margaret watched her daughter's world crumble as Sarah began to understand the full implications of learning that the man she had called father for the first 11 years of her life was not her biological parent, that her real father had died without ever knowing she existed, and that her mother had maintained this deception for nearly 3 decades rather than giving Sarah the opportunity to know the truth about her origins and genetic heritage. The wedding dress that had seemed so perfect that morning now felt like a costume from someone else's life, and the church that had held so many happy family memories now felt like a stage for public humiliation and the destruction of everything Sarah had believed about her identity and family relationships. The decision to postpone the wedding was made collectively by Sarah, Michael, and Margaret as they recognized that proceeding with the ceremony while Sarah was in such emotional turmoil would create memories of pain and confusion rather than joy and celebration, and that the marriage deserved to begin from a place of stability and happiness rather than crisis and revelation. The church coordinator was notified about the postponement, and she immediately began the process of informing the waiting guests that there would be a delay while the family addressed an unexpected emergency, though she tactfully avoided providing details about the nature of the situation that had created the need for postponement. The wedding vendors were understanding and professional about the last-minute change in plans, recognizing that family emergencies sometimes require flexibility and that the emotional well-being of the bride and groom must take priority over predetermined schedules and contractual obligations. Michael's parents approached the group with concern and compassion, offering their support and understanding about the postponement, while also making it clear that their love for Sarah and their excitement about welcoming her into their family was not dependent on any particular timeline or the resolution of whatever family issues were currently causing distress. The grace and acceptance that Michael's family showed in response to the crisis provided a stark contrast to Richard's destructive approach, and reminded Margaret of the importance of surrounding yourself with people who prioritize relationships over appearances and who understand that real families support each other through difficulties rather than creating additional drama and pain. Sarah's bridesmaids rallied around her with protective love and practical support, helping her out of her wedding dress and into comfortable clothes while also shielding her from curious guests and family members who wanted to understand what had happened but whose questions would only add to her emotional burden. The drive back to the bed and breakfast was conducted in heavy silence as Sarah stared out the window at the autumn landscape that had seemed so beautiful and promising that morning, but now felt like a reminder of how quickly perfect moments could be destroyed by information that changed everything you thought you knew about your life and relationships. Margaret sat beside her daughter, wanting desperately to provide comfort and reassurance, but recognizing that Sarah needed time and space to process the magnitude of what she had learned before she would be ready for conversations about forgiveness, understanding, and the complex factors that had influenced Margaret's choices 27 years ago. Michael drove with the kind of careful attention and gentle consideration that demonstrated his commitment to protecting Sarah's emotional well-being, while also respecting her need for quiet reflection during this overwhelming crisis. Back at the bed and breakfast, Sarah immediately went to her room and closed the door, leaving Margaret and Michael to deal with the practical aspects of notifying family members and wedding vendors about the postponement, while also trying to process their own emotions about the dramatic turn that the day had taken. Margaret called her sister Patricia, who had been like a second mother to Sarah throughout her childhood, and explained the situation while also asking for advice about how to handle the complex conversations that would need to happen in the coming days and weeks, as Sarah decided how she wanted to move forward with this new information about her parentage and family history. Patricia's response was characteristically practical and compassionate, focusing on Sarah's emotional needs, while also reminding Margaret that honesty and patience would be essential for rebuilding trust that had been damaged by years of well-intentioned but ultimately harmful secrecy. Michael spent the afternoon making phone calls to postpone their honeymoon travel arrangements and notify his medical residency program about the family emergency that would require him to take additional personal leave time, demonstrating the kind of supportive partnership that Margaret had always hoped Sarah would find in a life companion. His calm handling of the practical details allowed Margaret to focus on the emotional aspects of supporting Sarah through this crisis, and she felt grateful that her daughter had chosen someone whose character and values would provide stability and love regardless of whatever complications emerged from family secrets and unexpected revelations. The contrast between Michael's mature, supportive response to the crisis and Richard's selfish, destructive approach to revealing sensitive information highlighted the difference between people who prioritize relationships over personal vindication and those who use private information as weapons to inflict maximum emotional damage. The evening brought quiet conversations between Margaret and Michael as they tried to understand the full scope of the situation and develop a plan for supporting Sarah through the process of deciding how she wanted to handle this new information about her biological father and the implications for her relationship with both Richard and Margaret going forward. Michael's questions were thoughtful and compassionate, focused on understanding the emotional dynamics rather than assigning blame or judgment. And Margaret found herself appreciating his medical training and natural empathy as valuable assets for navigating the complex feelings and difficult decisions that lay ahead for their family. The realization that Sarah might want to learn more about Dr. James Mitchell's family, medical history, and personal background created additional layers of complexity that would require careful research and potentially painful conversations with people who had known him during the period when he had been involved with Margaret. Sarah emerged from her room late that evening, still wearing the comfortable clothes she had changed into after leaving the church, and sat quietly with Margaret and Michael as they discussed the immediate practical questions about rescheduling the wedding and the longer-term emotional work that would be required for processing this revelation and its impact on their family relationships. Her composure was remarkable given the magnitude of what she had learned, but Margaret could see that Sarah was still struggling to understand how to integrate this new information about her identity with everything she had previously believed about herself and her family history. The questions that Sarah asked were thoughtful and specific, demonstrating her analytical nature and her determination to understand the complete truth rather than accepting partial explanations that might leave room for additional secrets or deceptions in the future. The conversation that followed was the most honest and difficult discussion that Margaret and Sarah had ever shared, covering not only the circumstances of Sarah's conception, but also Margaret's reasons for maintaining uncertainty about paternity and her decision to prioritize family stability over absolute truth during Sarah's childhood and adolescence. Margaret explained to Sarah that her relationship with Dr. James Mitchell had developed during a period when she and Richard were attending couples counseling to address communication problems and different expectations about marriage, family planning, and career priorities that had been creating increasing tension and distance in their relationship. The professional boundary between therapist and client had gradually dissolved as Margaret found herself confiding in Dr. Mitchell about her loneliness, her doubts about her marriage, and her fears about bringing children into a relationship that felt unstable and emotionally unsatisfying to both partners. Dr. Mitchell had been recently divorced himself and was struggling with his own feelings of failure and isolation, which created a shared vulnerability that eventually led to an inappropriate personal relationship that violated his professional ethics and complicated an already difficult period in Margaret's life. The relationship had lasted only 3 months, during which time Margaret had been living with her sister in Atlanta while she and Richard took a break from their marriage to evaluate whether they wanted to continue working on their problems or pursue divorce. When Margaret discovered she was pregnant, she had immediately ended her relationship with Dr. Mitchell and returned to Richard with a genuine desire to rebuild their marriage and create a stable home for their unborn child, believing that parenthood might provide the motivation and common purpose that their relationship had been lacking. Richard had been excited about the pregnancy and had interpreted Margaret's return as evidence that their separation had helped them both recognize the value of their marriage and their commitment to making it work despite their previous difficulties. The timing of the pregnancy had made it impossible for Margaret to determine with certainty whether Richard or Dr. Mitchell was the biological father without pursuing DNA testing that would have required her to reveal the affair and potentially destroy any chance of reconciling with Richard and providing their child with a stable 2-parent home. Margaret's decision to maintain uncertainty about paternity had been motivated by her belief that the most important thing was providing Sarah with a loving, stable family environment rather than absolute certainty about biological relationships that might create legal complications, emotional trauma, and social stigma that could affect Sarah's childhood and development. Dr. Mitchell had respected Margaret's decision to end their relationship and pursue reconciliation with Richard, and they had agreed that any potential paternity questions would remain unresolved unless specific medical or legal circumstances made DNA testing necessary for Sarah's health or well-being. The agreement had felt reasonable and protective at the time, but Margaret now understood that her choice to prioritize immediate family stability over long-term honesty had created the potential for exactly the kind of devastating revelation that had just destroyed Sarah's wedding day and damaged their relationship in ways that might never be fully repaired. Sarah listened to her mother's explanation with the kind of focused attention that she brought to medical diagnoses and treatment decisions, asking specific questions about the timeline, the nature of Margaret's relationship with Dr. Mitchell, and the factors that had influenced her decision to maintain secrecy rather than pursuing clarity about paternity through DNA testing or honest communication with Richard. Her questions revealed both intellectual curiosity and deep emotional pain as she struggled to understand how the mother she had always trusted completely could have maintained such a significant deception for nearly 3 decades while also building a relationship based on what Sarah had believed was complete honesty and mutual respect. The realization that Margaret had chosen to protect herself and Richard from difficult truths rather than providing Sarah with accurate information about her biological heritage felt like a fundamental betrayal of the values and principles that Margaret had taught her throughout her childhood and adolescence. Michael participated in the conversation as a supportive listener and occasional mediator when emotions became too intense for productive communication, using his medical training and natural empathy to help both Margaret and Sarah express their feelings without attacking each other or becoming defensive about choices that had been made under very different circumstances nearly 3 decades ago. His presence provided stability and perspective that allowed the conversation to remain focused on understanding and healing rather than blame and recrimination. And Margaret felt grateful that Sarah had chosen a partner whose character and wisdom would help them navigate this crisis together rather than allowing it to create additional divisions within their family relationships. The questions that Michael asked were designed to help both women understand each other's perspectives and identify the steps that would be necessary for rebuilding trust and moving forward with their relationship, despite the damage that had been caused by years of well-intentioned but ultimately harmful secrecy. The discussion revealed that Sarah's primary concern was not about her biological paternity, but about the breakdown of trust that resulted from learning that her mother had maintained such a significant secret for her entire life, while teaching her that honesty and courage were essential values for maintaining healthy relationships. Sarah expressed hurt and confusion about the fact that Margaret had never given her the opportunity to know Dr. Mitchell or learn about his family history, medical background, and personal characteristics that might have provided valuable information about her own identity, interests, and genetic predispositions. The revelation that her biological father had died 3 years earlier without ever knowing he had a daughter created a sense of loss and missed opportunity that was particularly painful, given Sarah's career in medicine and her natural curiosity about genetics, family history, and the factors that influence personality development and life choices. Margaret acknowledged that her decision to maintain secrecy had been based on fear rather than wisdom, and that her desire to protect Sarah from complicated family dynamics had ultimately deprived her daughter of important information about her heritage and identity that belonged to her, regardless of the emotional discomfort it might cause for the adults involved. The admission that fear had driven her choices rather than courage and honesty felt like another layer of betrayal to Sarah, who had always believed that her mother faced difficult situations with strength and integrity rather than avoidance and self-protection. The weeks following the postponed wedding became a period of intensive family counseling, research into Dr. Mitchell's background and family history, and careful reconstruction of the relationship between Margaret and Sarah based on a foundation of complete honesty rather than protective secrecy. Sarah insisted on learning everything possible about her biological father, including his educational background, medical specialties, personal interests, and the family history that could provide insight into her own genetic heritage and potential health risks that might be relevant to her medical career and future family planning. Margaret cooperated fully with Sarah's research efforts, providing contact information for people who had known Dr. Mitchell professionally and personally, while also acknowledging that some information might be painful or disappointing. As Sarah learned about the man who had contributed to her existence but had never had the opportunity to know her as his daughter, the investigation into Dr. Mitchell's life revealed that he had been a respected psychiatrist who specialized in marriage and family therapy, that he had struggled with depression and anxiety throughout his adult life, and that he had 2 older children from his first marriage who were now adults living in different states with families of their own. Sarah's discovery that she had half-siblings who had never known of her existence created additional emotional complexity as she decided whether to reach out to them and potentially disrupt their lives with information about their father's affair and the daughter he had never known existed. The medical information that emerged from Dr. Mitchell's family history provided valuable insight into genetic predispositions that could affect Sarah's health and any future children she might have with Michael. But it also revealed a family pattern of mental health challenges that helped explain some of Sarah's own struggles with anxiety and perfectionism that she had always attributed to environmental factors rather than genetic inheritance. Michael remained a constant source of support and stability throughout Sarah's research and emotional processing, demonstrating the kind of unconditional love and commitment that helped her understand that her identity and worth were not dependent on her biological parentage or the circumstances of her conception. His family also provided additional perspective and support, sharing their own stories of adoption, blended families, and the various ways that love and commitment create meaningful family relationships regardless of genetic connections or traditional family structures. The contrast between Michael's family's accepting, supportive response to the revelation and Richard's destructive, selfish approach helped Sarah understand that character and choice matter more than biology in determining who deserves to be considered family and who has earned the right to participate in important life events and decisions. The relationship between Margaret and Sarah required months of careful rebuilding as they worked through the trust issues and communication patterns that had been damaged by years of secrecy and the traumatic way that the truth had finally been revealed. Sarah eventually came to understand that Margaret's choices had been motivated by love and a desire to provide stability rather than malicious deception. But she also insisted on establishing new patterns of complete honesty and open communication that would prevent similar secrets from damaging their relationship in the future. The counseling process helped both women understand how fear and the desire to protect others from difficult truths could actually cause more harm than honest communication about complex family dynamics and personal history. Sarah and Michael rescheduled their wedding for the following spring, creating a new celebration that incorporated acknowledgement of Sarah's complicated family history, while also emphasizing their commitment to building a marriage based on honesty, acceptance, and mutual support through whatever challenges and revelations the future might bring. The ceremony included a tribute to Dr. James Mitchell and recognition of the complex circumstances that had led to Sarah's existence, while also celebrating the love and dedication that Margaret had provided as a single mother, and the ongoing commitment that Michael's family had shown to welcoming Sarah regardless of her biological parentage or family complications. Richard was not invited to the rescheduled wedding, as Sarah decided that his destructive approach to revealing family secrets had disqualified him from participating in future celebrations, and that her emotional well-being required maintaining boundaries with people who prioritize their own vindication over the happiness and stability of others. The experience of having her wedding day destroyed by family secrets and unexpected revelations ultimately strengthened Sarah's relationship with Michael and deepened her understanding of the importance of choosing partners and family members who demonstrate consistent love and support, rather than conditional acceptance based on genetic relationships or perfect family histories. Her career in emergency medicine provided additional perspective on the ways that families can be created through choice and commitment rather than biology alone. And she began specializing in treating patients who were dealing with their own family crises and identity challenges. The skills she developed for helping others navigate complex family dynamics and traumatic revelations became valuable assets in her own ongoing process of healing from the damage that Richard's selfish timing and approach had caused to what should have been the happiest day of her life. The story of Sarah's disrupted wedding became a cautionary tale within their community about the importance of handling family secrets with wisdom and compassion, rather than using them as weapons to inflict maximum emotional damage on people who have built their lives on incomplete information. Margaret's experience taught her that honesty, even when difficult and painful, creates stronger foundation for family relationships than protective secrecy that ultimately deprives people of important information about their identity and heritage. The lessons learned from this crisis continue to influence how both Margaret and Sarah approach communication, trust, and the ongoing work of building and maintaining healthy family relationships based on acceptance, honesty, and unconditional love rather than perfect circumstances or traditional family structures. Thank you for staying with me through this incredible journey of family secrets, betrayal, and the long road to healing and understanding. Margaret and Sarah's story reminds us that sometimes the people who claim to love us can cause the deepest pain when they prioritize their own needs over our happiness and well-being. But it also shows us that genuine love and commitment can survive even the most devastating revelations when we choose honesty and healing over revenge and resentment. If this story has touched your heart or reminded you of your own experiences with family secrets and unexpected revelations, please stay connected with our community by clicking on one of the videos appearing on your screen right now to continue exploring these powerful themes of resilience, forgiveness, and the complex beauty of human relationships that transcend biology and traditional expectations.